Official logs and forgotten case files hold secrets that defy explanation. These are the moments when reality cracks open and something else peers through the darkness from the frozen edges of the world. You're about to hear stories that blur the line between memory and nightmare. Enter the world of true horror stories and subscribe, but only if you're really not afraid. Seriously. The Blinking Beacon. Marcus Thorne was a man who understood machines and respected the sea. A perfect combination for a Coast Guard technician stationed on Middleton Island. His job was a study in reliable monotony, a cycle of diagnostics, preventative maintenance, and the quiet companionship of diesel generators. The island itself was a mere speck in the Gulf of Alaska, a lonely outpost whose sole purpose was to hold a light against the crushing darkness of the northern Pacific. Marcus didn't mind the isolation. In fact, he preferred it. The clear, logical language of wiring diagrams and relay switches made more sense to him than most people. He knew the Middleton Island light intimately, from the 1,000-pound Fresnel lens that crowned its peak to the thick, insulated cables that ran deep into its concrete foundation. He could diagnose a failing bulb by the subtle shift in the generator's hum, could predict a relay failure by the humidity in the air. This place was his sanctuary of systems, a fortress of predictability against the chaos of the open ocean. So when the anomaly began in April of 1992, it felt less like a malfunction and more like a personal betrayal. It started with a call from a fishing trawler, the Northern Gale, its captain's voice crackling with annoyance over the radio. He reported the Middleton light was off sequence, its rhythmic pulse replaced by a stuttering, erratic flash that was more confusing than helpful. Marcus thanked him, logged the call, and felt a familiar coil of professional focus tighten in his gut. A storm had passed through 2 nights prior, lashing the island with salt spray and 60-knot winds. Corrosion was the likely culprit, a bit of salt water working its way into a junction box, creating a short. It was a simple problem, an expected problem, and he went about preparing for the climb with the calm efficiency of a seasoned expert. The tower stood 100 feet tall, a cylinder of white-painted concrete that seemed to groan under the weight of the perpetually gray sky. The ascent was a spiral of cold iron steps, each one echoing his steady footfalls through the hollow structure. Outside, the wind howled a mournful song, a constant reminder of his solitude. He reached the lamp room, a glass-enclosed space that offered a dizzying panorama of the churning slate-gray water. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and heated metal. Everything appeared normal. The backup bulb was intact, the rotation motor was functioning perfectly, and the primary array showed no immediate signs of damage. He ran a diagnostic on the control panel, his fingers moving with practiced ease over the switches and dials. The system reported all clear. Frowning, Marcus bypassed the automated controller and activated the lamp manually. It flared to life, casting a brilliant white beam across the waves. He watched it for a full 10 minutes, and it held its steady, prescribed rhythm without a single flicker. Thinking the issue might be intermittent, a ghost in the machine, he reset the system, logged the diagnostic as clear, and descended back into the relative warmth of the equipment shack at the tower's base. He spent the rest of the day on other tasks, the incident nagging at the back of his mind but filed away as a resolved glitch. That evening, as twilight bled into an impenetrable, starless dark, he looked out his window and saw it. The beacon was not flashing its familiar, comforting pulse. It was blinking, a frantic, deliberate series of short and long bursts that bore no resemblance to its designated signal. It was a language. Marcus felt a cold knot form in his stomach that had nothing to do with the Alaskan chill. He grabbed a notepad and a pen, his heart thumping against his ribs with a new, unwelcome rhythm. For over an hour, he sat in the darkness, transcribing the flashes, his hand shaking slightly. The message repeated itself, a loop of meaningless letters at first, then coalescing into something disturbingly coherent. It wasn't an SOS. He knew the emergency patterns by heart. This was something else entirely. After deciphering the sequence, he was left with a single, impossible phrase, spelled out in perfect Morse code by his malfunctioning light. SOLITUDE. It wasn't a distress call. It was a name. He spent a sleepless night checking maritime databases, cross-referencing registries, searching for any vessel, active or decommissioned, named Solitude. He found nothing. No ship with that name had ever been registered with the Coast Guard, or any international maritime authority he could access. The next morning, fueled by black coffee and a growing sense of dread, he made the climb again. This time, he wouldn't be looking for a simple short. This felt different. Deep inside the lamp housing, behind the primary lens assembly, he found the source of the problem. What he saw made the hairs on his arms stand on end. This was no malfunction. The internal wiring to the individual bulbs of the main array had been physically altered. Tiny jumper cables, meticulously placed, rerouted the electrical current, bypassing the main controller to create the specific pattern he had witnessed. The work was precise, complex, and utterly impossible. No one else was on the island. He hadn't had a supply drop in over a month. The storm had been severe, but no storm could resolder electrical connections into a coherent message. He stood there in the wind-buffeted lamp room, 100 feet above the waves, and felt a profound, terrifying sense of violation. He was not alone. With trembling hands, he carefully removed the unauthorized wiring, his tools feeling clumsy and foreign. He triple-checked every connection, restoring the beacon to its factory specifications. Before descending, he paused, scanning the horizon, the endless expanse of gray water meeting a gray sky. He saw nothing but waves and clouds, but the feeling of being watched was so intense, it was almost a physical pressure against his skin. That night, the beacon flashed its correct, steady signal. A single pulse every 10 seconds. Marcus watched it for hours, a shotgun resting across his lap, his sense of relief warring with a deep-seated fear that refused to recede. For 3 days, the light behaved. The island returned to its familiar, monotonous rhythm, and Marcus began to wonder if he had imagined the intricacy of the rewiring, if stress and isolation had finally cracked his rational mind. On the 4th night, the radio crackled to life again. It was the northern gale. The captain's voice was no longer annoyed. It was strained, laced with a fear that resonated with Marcus's own. The light was spelling that name again. SOLITUDE. Marcus didn't even need to look. He could feel it. He could feel the change in the air, the way the generator's hum seemed to drop a half step in pitch. He didn't climb the tower again. He knew what he would find, and he knew he hadn't been the one to change it. He simply locked the door to his quarters, turned his radio to the emergency frequency, and waited for dawn. He filed a report describing a critical, unresolvable electrical malfunction in the beacon's control system, citing extreme weather damage and requesting an immediate parts shipment and a replacement technician. He omitted any mention of Morse code or phantom ships. He knew how it would sound. 2 weeks later, his relief arrived. As Marcus boarded the helicopter, he took one last look at the White Tower. It seemed to him that it was no longer just a structure of concrete and steel, but a headstone marking a place where logic had died. He never spoke of what truly happened on Middleton Island. Months later, he learned from a former colleague that the beacon had continued its strange broadcast for another week after he left. Then, one night, it simply stopped. An inspection team found the wiring exactly as it should be, with no signs of tampering. The official USCG maintenance log for April 1992 simply states, "Intermittent signal anomaly resolved." But Marcus knew it wasn't resolved. It was just waiting, spelling out its lonely, impossible name into the vast, uncaring darkness of the sea. The cold hangar. In the dead of the Alaskan winter, Alaskan Air Force Base exists in a state of perpetual twilight, a sprawling complex of concrete and steel fighting a losing war against the encroaching cold. For Senior Airman David Keller, an aircraft mechanic, the cold was just a number on a thermometer, a factor to be managed with insulated gear and powerful industrial heaters. Hangar 3, his assigned workspace, was a cavernous structure large enough to swallow a fleet of fighter jets. Its massive clamshell doors remained sealed against the elements, and a network of heating ducts roared day and night, keeping the interior at a stable, workable 50 degrees Fahrenheit. David was a man of systems and specifications. He understood the intricate mechanics of a jet engine, the precise tolerances of hydraulic lines, and the logical flow of electrical current. The world, to him, was a series of complex but ultimately solvable problems. So when Hangar 3 began to get cold in January of 1988, he approached it as just another system to diagnose. It started subtly. The other mechanics began complaining, their breath pluming in the air despite the heaters blasting at full capacity. David, ever the pragmatist, checked the thermostats. They were set correctly. He inspected the heating units themselves, confirming a steady output of hot air. Yet, the temperature inside the hangar continued to drop. Within a week, it had fallen 30 degrees, hovering at a biting 20 Fahrenheit. Maintenance crews were forced to work in full Arctic gear, their movements stiff and clumsy, their tools painfully cold to the touch. The fog of their breath was so thick it was like a persistent, localized weather system inside the building. David found it illogical. The hangar was a sealed environment. The heaters were functioning perfectly, consuming fuel at their normal rate. According to every law of thermodynamics, he knew the space should have been warm. Yet, the cold deepened, becoming not just a temperature, but a presence. It felt heavy, ancient, and unnervingly still. It clung to the metal skin of the dormant F-4 Phantom jets parked inside, frosting their canopies and coating their wings in a delicate layer of rime. The strangest part was the sound, or rather, the lack of it, followed by a sound that shouldn't exist. The usual cacophony of a maintenance hangar, the clang of wrenches, the hiss of pneumatic tools, the distant roar of the heaters, was dampened, swallowed by the oppressive cold. And in the resulting silence, crews began to hear things. A low, whining hum, like the sound of a turbine slowly spooling up, seemed to emanate from the grounded, powerless aircraft. Several mechanics filed reports, claiming they could feel vibrations through the concrete floor, faint at first, then growing in intensity before fading away to nothing. David, still clinging to logic, dismissed it as auditory pareidolia, the mind playing tricks in the strange, muffled acoustics of the freezing hangar. He requested facility maintenance run a full diagnostic. Engineers arrived with thermal imagers and data loggers, determined to find a rational explanation. They suspected a massive, undiscovered breach in the hangar's insulation or a strange atmospheric inversion layer forming under the high ceiling. The data they collected only deepened the mystery. The thermal cameras showed no cold spots, no drafts, no compromised seals. Instead, they revealed a uniform, pervasive cold that seemed to radiate from the center of the hangar itself. The data loggers, left overnight, produced the most chilling evidence. At precisely 3:07 a.m. each night, the temperature inside the sealed, heated hangar would plummet catastrophically, dropping to an impossible 40 degrees below zero in a matter of minutes. It would hold that temperature for exactly 1 hour, then rapidly return to its previous 20 degrees. The base's power grid logs showed no corresponding energy loss. The hangar's heating system never faltered. It was as if a bubble of pure, Arctic void was simply appearing and disappearing inside the building, defying all known physics. The wing commander, a stern man with no patience for nonsense, ordered the hangar cleared. David was part of the final sweep team, tasked with ensuring all equipment was secured before the massive doors were locked and chained. As they worked, the turbine sound started again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from one jet, but from all of them at once, a chorus of ghostly engines whining in the freezing air. The lights in the hangar flickered, their fluorescent buzz dropping to a guttural hum. The heavy cold intensified, pressing in on them, making it hard to breathe. One of the younger airmen panicked, dropping his toolkit with a clatter that echoed unnaturally in the dead air, and ran for the exit. David held his ground, his rational mind scrambling for an explanation. A harmonic resonance, a freak electrical surge. But as he looked at the frost-covered canopy of the nearest phantom, he saw something that shattered his composure. On the inside of the glass, a single handprint was clearly visible. Fingers splayed, as if someone or something was pressing against it from within the sealed cockpit. He stared, mesmerized and horrified, as the handprint slowly faded, absorbed back into the uniform layer of ice. That was enough. He gave the order to evacuate, his voice tight and strained. They sealed the hangar doors, the chains rattling with a terrible finality. For the rest of the winter, Hangar 3 remained off limits, a silent, frozen tomb on the edge of the flight line. The official explanation was a critical structural issue with the heating infrastructure pending extensive repairs. But everyone at Alaskan knew the truth. They could feel it when they walked past the building. A palpable wave of cold that seemed to leach the warmth from their bodies, even through layers of insulation. David Keller put in for a transfer to a base in a warmer climate shortly after. He never again wanted to experience a cold that wasn't just an absence of heat, but the presence of something else. The U.S. Air Force facility maintenance record from January 1988 is a thick file filled with inconclusive reports, anomalous data logs, and expert testimonies that all fail to explain how a sealed building could generate its own Arctic night. The final page is a single stamped entry. Case closed. Anomaly unresolved. The hangar was eventually reopened the following summer, the strange phenomena having vanished as mysteriously as it appeared. But the mechanics who worked there still talk in hushed tones, and no one, not ever, volunteers for the night shift in the cold hangar. The empty net. For 20 years, Ben Carter had pulled a living from the cold, silty waters of Bristol Bay. He was a Dillingham fisherman, a man whose life was dictated by the tides, the salmon runs, and the ever-present threat of a sudden squall. His hands were scarred maps of pulled nets and tangled lines, and he knew the shifting channels of the Nushagak River better than he knew the streets of the town he called home. He was a creature of habit and practicality, his world defined by the tangible things: the weight of fish in his gill net, the smell of diesel from his boat's engine, the satisfying ache in his muscles after a long day on the water. In July of 2007, that tangible world was torn open by a catch he couldn't explain. He was working a familiar drift near the mouth of the river, the water murky with glacial runoff. The pull on the net felt wrong. It wasn't the frantic, thrashing weight of a good haul of sockeye, nor was it the dead, unyielding drag of a sunken log. It was a lumpy, awkward resistance, a snag that felt both heavy and strangely pliant. With a grunt of effort, he worked the hydraulic drum, slowly winching the net from the depths. As it broke the surface, his heart sank. It wasn't fish. It was a tangled mass of debris, a ghost net's worth of lost gear that had fouled his equipment. Annoyed, he began the laborious process of clearing the mess, cursing his luck. But as he pulled the first items aboard, the annoyance curdled into a cold, prickling unease. This wasn't old fishing gear. It was personal effects. The first thing he untangled was a backpack, a modern design made of heavy-duty nylon, its color bleached by the water but otherwise remarkably intact. Its weight was unnerving. Unzipping the main compartment, he found it packed with waterlogged textbooks, a sodden sleeping bag, and a small, waterproof Pelican case. Inside the case, miraculously dry, was a camera and a leather-bound journal. He set it aside, his hands trembling slightly, and continued clearing the net. Next came a pair of hiking boots, heavy and well-worn, their laces still tied. Then a length of climbing rope, and finally, tangled in the last few feet of mesh, a tattered wallet. He opened it carefully, the leather stiff and warped. Inside, behind a cloudy plastic window, was a University of Alaska student ID. The photo showed a smiling young man with shaggy brown hair and a confident grin. The name on the card was Daniel Miller. Ben felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the damp Alaskan air. He knew that name. Everyone in the region knew that name. Daniel Miller had been a graduate student who had vanished 3 years prior while on a solo research trip far upriver, deep in the interior. An extensive search had turned up nothing but his abandoned campsite near a tributary of the Mulchatna River, more than 200 river miles from where Ben was now floating. Ben immediately called the Alaska Wildlife Troopers. He secured the net's contents as best he could and motored back to Dillingham, a heavy silence filling the boat's small cabin. The usual, triumphant feeling of a return to port was replaced by a somber dread. He felt like he was piloting a hearse. The troopers met him at the dock. They listened to his story, their faces grim and professional, and carefully cataloged each item he had recovered. They confirmed the identity. The gear belonged to Daniel Miller. The journal was the most haunting piece of evidence. Its final entries described Miller's excitement about his research, his observations of the local geology, and his growing unease about strange noises he'd been hearing at night around his camp. Sounds he described as not animal, not human, something like rock grinding on rock. The last entry was brief and scrawled, "It's following the river. I have to get out." The official investigation that followed only deepened the mystery. Hydrologists and search and rescue experts were brought in to analyze the river currents. Their conclusion was unanimous and deeply unsettling. Given the location of Miller's last known campsite, it was physically impossible for his gear to have drifted that far downriver and remained so clustered together. The backpack, the boots, the wallet, They should have been scattered over 100 miles of riverbed, buried under seasons of silt, or washed into different side channels. The heavy backpack, in particular, should have sunk and stayed put. To have it all end up in a single gill net, 200 miles downstream, defied every model of river dynamics. It was as if someone had carefully gathered the items and placed them in the water right where Ben would find them. The troopers explored every possibility. Could someone have found the gear upriver and dumped it? It was unlikely. The area was incredibly remote, and no new activity had been reported there for years. Was it a cruel prank? The level of effort and the specificity of the items made that seem equally improbable. The investigation stalled, leaving an official report filled with question marks. The case of Daniel Miller was moved from missing person to presumed deceased. But the circumstances of the recovery were filed away as an unexplained anomaly. For Ben Carter, the incident was a fundamental violation of his understanding of the world. The river, his lifelong provider and partner, had shown him something impossible. He could no longer look at its murky currents without thinking of that net, of that impossible catch rising from the depths. He saw the smiling face of Daniel Miller every time he closed his eyes. A week after the discovery, Ben pulled his boat from the water, ending his fishing season months early. He told everyone he was having engine trouble, but the other fishermen knew better. They saw the haunted look in his eyes, the way he now flinched at the sound of the tide turning. He sold his boat and his permit the following spring and took a job working at the cannery, a land-based job where he never had to look at the river again. The Alaska Wildlife Troopers report from July 2007 is a dry, factual document, but it cannot hide the strangeness of its own contents. It details the improbable recovery of the items, the expert testimony on river dynamics, and concludes with no conclusion at all. It is a sterile record of a day when the river gave up a secret it should have kept, a ghost story told in the cold, hard language of law enforcement. The Arctic Roadhouse. The Dalton Highway is a lonely ribbon of gravel and asphalt, stretching 400 miles through some of the most desolate and beautiful wilderness on Earth. For those who travel it, the roadhouses dotted along its length are more than just businesses. They are vital sanctuaries of warmth, light, and humanity in a vast and indifferent landscape. In the winter of 1995, Sarah Jenkins was working as a seasonal cook at one such roadhouse near Coldfoot, a small but essential stop for the truckers hauling supplies to the Prudhoe Bay oil fields. She was a practical woman in her late 20s, seeking refuge from a messy breakup in the lower 48 and finding a strange comfort in the harsh, uncompromising reality of the Arctic. Her days were a blur of frying eggs, brewing coffee, and listening to the gravelly voices of truckers who all seemed to have a story to tell. Her world was one of handwritten ledgers, temperamental generators, and the constant low hum of the wind against the building's log walls. One February morning, Sarah came downstairs to start the coffee and found something unusual. The night clerk, a grizzled old-timer named Gus, was staring at the guest logbook with a look of profound confusion. He pointed a trembling finger at the page. 3 cabins, numbers 5, 7, and 8, were marked as rented for the night. The entries were written in Gus's own shaky cursive, noting cash payments for each. The problem was, Gus swore he hadn't rented any cabins. He had been on duty all night, and not a single soul had come through the door. He remembered the night clearly. The generator had been acting up, causing the lights to flicker, and he'd spent most of his shift reading an old paperback by the light of a propane lantern. He hadn't seen a single pair of headlights on the highway. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, assumed Gus must have been dozing and simply forgotten. "Let's check the cabins," she suggested, pulling on her heavy parka. The air outside was a physical shock, a dry, brittle cold that stole the breath from her lungs. A thick layer of fresh, undisturbed snow covered everything, sparkling under the pale morning sun. As they approached the cabins, a cold knot of dread began to form in Sarah's stomach. There were no footprints leading to or from the doors of cabins 5, 7, or 8. Not a single track marred the pristine blanket of white. Gus fumbled with the master key, his hands shaking so much he could barely fit it in the lock. The door to cabin 5 swung open with a soft creak. The room was tidy, but the bed was unmistakably slept in. The sheets were rumpled, and the pillows bore the distinct impression of a head. On the small bedside table, a $20 bill was neatly folded. It was the exact price of a single night's stay. The air in the cabin was frigid, far colder than it should have been, with a strange static quality to it. It was the same in cabin 7, and again in cabin 8. Each room had a rumpled bed, no luggage, no personal items, and the exact cash amount for the rental left on the table. In cabin 8, there was one additional detail. A half-empty glass of water sat on the desk, the water inside frozen solid, even though the cabin's small heater was still faintly ticking. Sarah and Gus stood in the snow, staring at the silent cabins, the logical framework of their world beginning to fracture. Gus was adamant. No one had been there. The snow was his proof. Sarah wanted to believe him, but the evidence inside the cabins was undeniable. They checked the kitchen. The night order slips showed 3 identical meals had been ordered and presumably delivered as room service. A steak dinner, well done, with a side of coffee. Sarah hadn't cooked them. Gus hadn't delivered them. Yet the slips were there, written in a cramped, unfamiliar hand. The logical next step was to check the security cameras. The roadhouse had a simple, closed-circuit system that monitored the parking lot and the front entrance. When they went to review the tape from the previous night, they found it was useless. The footage was a scramble of static, starting at the approximate time the generator had begun to fail. For the entire 8-hour period, the guests would have arrived, stayed, and left. The cameras had recorded nothing but a blizzard of electronic snow. A call to the Department of Transportation way station 50 miles down the road only deepened the mystery. Their automated vehicle logs, which tracked every truck and car that passed, showed no traffic on that stretch of the Dalton between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. The road had been empty. It was as if 3 guests had simply materialized inside the cabins, lived there for a night, and then vanished into thin air, leaving only rumpled sheets and cold cash behind. The incident was never officially reported. Who would they tell? What would they say? Sarah and Gus tried to forget it, to file it away as a strange, shared hallucination brought on by isolation and fatigue. But the feeling of wrongness lingered. The 3 cabins felt different afterward, colder, emptier. Truckers who stayed in them would complain of a strange, oppressive silence, of waking up in the middle of the night feeling as though someone had just been in the room. Sarah finished her seasonal contract and left Alaska without looking back. She couldn't shake the image of those undisturbed snowfields, a perfect white canvas with an impossible story hidden just beneath the surface. The official DOT way station report for that night in February 1995 still exists in a dusty archive, a simple printout of data that shows a long, uninterrupted period of inactivity. It's a document that proves, in its own silent way, that whatever checked into the Arctic Roadhouse that night didn't need a road to get there. Ice Fog Patrol. January in Fairbanks is not just a month. It is a physical state of being. The air itself can freeze, transforming into a dense, crystalline shroud known as ice fog. It's a phenomenon unique to extreme cold, where water vapor sublimates directly into tiny ice crystals, hanging in the air like a luminous, blinding mist. For State Trooper Ben Carter, driving through it was a disorienting, hypnotic experience. The world beyond his windshield dissolved into a swirling vortex of white, his headlights cutting a weak, diffuse tunnel through the frozen vapor. Patrolling the empty highways on nights like this was a lonely, surreal duty. On one such night, in 2011, the surreal tipped over into the terrifying. Ben was on a routine patrol of the Stees Highway, a stretch of road that winds north of the city into the dark, empty wilderness. The ice fog was the thickest he had ever seen it, reducing visibility to less than 20 feet. His world shrank to the glowing dashboard of his patrol car, the rhythmic sweep of his wipers, and the endless swirling whiteness ahead. He was driving slowly, cautiously, when he first noticed them in his rearview mirror, a pair of headlights following at a steady distance. It was unusual to see another vehicle out this far, this late, in these conditions, but not unheard of. He assumed it was a local, someone familiar with the treacherous roads. He continued on, the lights remaining a constant, unwavering presence behind him. They didn't try to pass. They didn't fall back. They just stayed there, perfectly paced with his own vehicle, two ghostly orbs in the swirling fog. After a few miles, a subtle unease began to creep into Ben's mind. The headlights were strange. They seemed too bright, too focused for the conditions, and they didn't seem to have a discernible vehicle attached to them. They were just 2 points of intense white light, floating in the frozen mist. He tried to rationalize it. The ice fog could play tricks on the eyes, scattering and reflecting light in bizarre ways. Maybe it was an optical illusion. He tapped his brakes, slowing his cruiser. The lights behind him slowed in perfect synchronicity, maintaining their exact distance. He accelerated. They accelerated, matching his speed instantly. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. This was no ordinary driver. He reached for his radio to call in the vehicle's position, to run a check on a license plate he couldn't see. Before he could key the microphone, his radio emitted a loud burst of static and went dead. The dashboard lights flickered, and the GPS screen went blank. He was electronically blind. For 12 minutes, the silent, terrifying procession continued. Ben, a seasoned trooper trained to handle high-stress situations, felt a primal fear he hadn't experienced since his rookie years. He was being stalked by something that didn't obey the normal rules of the road, or perhaps the normal rules of reality. His thoughts raced. Was it a prank? A sophisticated trap? He was miles from backup. His communications were down, and he was being relentlessly tailed by a phantom. He remembered a stretch of road ahead where the highway rose onto a slight ridge, a place where the fog sometimes thinned out. He decided to make a stand there. He would pull over and confront whoever or whatever was behind him. He pressed down on the accelerator, his tires spinning for a moment on the icy road before finding purchase. The cruiser surged forward. The lights behind him matched his speed without hesitation. As he reached the ridge, the fog began to clear, just as he had hoped. The swirling ice crystals gave way to a shocking, star-filled clarity. He looked in his rearview mirror, his hand hovering over the butt of his service pistol. The headlights were still there, blazing with an unnatural intensity. And then, in an instant, they were gone. They didn't drive off. They didn't turn. They simply vanished, as if a switch had been flipped. He slammed on the brakes, his cruiser skidding to a halt in the middle of the empty, silent highway. He threw the car in reverse, backing up until he was at the exact spot where the lights had disappeared. There were no turnoffs, no side roads. The snow on the shoulders of the highway was pristine, untouched. There were no tire tracks other than his own. The vehicle had simply ceased to exist. Shaken, Ben drove back to the barracks in Fairbanks, the silence in his car feeling heavier and more menacing than any noise. His radio and GPS came back online the moment he hit the city limits. He filed an incident report, his words feeling inadequate to describe the sheer wrongness of the experience. He described a possible stalking incident involving an unidentified vehicle, but he knew it was more than that. The next day, his supervisor called him in to review the dashcam footage. The video was chillingly clear. For 12 solid minutes, the footage showed the two bright headlights tailing his cruiser, just as he had described. They were unwavering, perfectly spaced, a constant, menacing presence. The technicians analyzing the footage found something that turned the strange incident into an impossible one. They isolated the frames where the headlights were visible and ran them through enhancement software. The lights themselves had no source. There was no grille, no bumper, no reflection of a vehicle body around them. They were just disembodied orbs of light. Then they noticed the pattern. As they compared the footage from minute to minute, they realized the image of the headlights wasn't just similar, it was identical. The light flare, the position, the intensity. It was a perfect, frame-for-frame duplication, repeating itself over and over. It wasn't a vehicle following him. It was an image, a recording of some kind, being projected into the ice fog. The license plate was unreadable, a blur of pure white light. The official explanation logged in the Alaska State Troopers' dashcam archive from January 2011 is unresolved visual anomaly due to extreme weather. But Ben Carter knew what he saw. He had been followed by a ghost, a memory of a car that wasn't there. Its phantom headlights burning a permanent image into his mind. He never patrolled the Steese Highway in an ice fog again. The dormitory wing, the Saint Elias boarding school in Sitka had been a place of learning and life for over a century. Its grand timber-framed buildings weathering countless Alaskan winters. But time and changing educational standards had caught up with it. And in the late 1990s, its doors were closed for good. The campus was left to the care of the wind, the rain, and a single, overworked maintenance man named Frank Miller. Frank's job was a lonely one, a constant battle against entropy. He repaired leaky roofs, boarded up broken windows, and walked the silent, empty halls, his footsteps echoing like ghosts of the students who once rushed through them. In March of 2002, one of those silent wings decided to speak. It was just after midnight when the piercing shriek of a fire alarm shattered the quiet of Frank's small caretaker's cottage. He jolted awake, his heart pounding. He checked the main alarm panel, a relic from the 1970s that was connected to every building on campus. A single red light was flashing, indicating the source of the alarm. North wing, 3rd floor, the old dormitory. Frank felt a surge of cold dread. The north wing had been sealed for over 5 years. Its doors were chained and padlocked from the outside. The power to that section had been cut at the main breaker. There was no reason for a fire alarm to go off there. unless squatters had broken in and started a fire. He called the Sitka Fire Department, his voice tight with urgency, and then grabbed a heavy flashlight and a set of bolt cutters, his mind racing. He met the fire engine at the chained entrance to the north wing. The building stood dark and silent, showing no outward signs of a fire. No smoke, no glow of flames. The alarm, however, continued its relentless, deafening scream. The fire captain, a man Frank knew well, gave him a skeptical look but ordered his crew to prepare the hoses. Frank snapped the thick chain with the bolt cutters, the sound echoing unnaturally in the night. Together, he and two firefighters pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The air that billowed out was not hot and smoky. It was shockingly cold, a damp, cellar-like chill that carried the musty scent of dust and decay. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing a long, silent hallway lined with closed doors. The alarm was deafening in the enclosed space. As they moved deeper into the building, they began to see things that made no sense. The mattresses from several of the dormitory rooms had been dragged out into the hallway and arranged in a strange, almost barricade-like formation. The doors to those rooms were wedged open from the inside with splintered pieces of wooden chairs. It looked as if someone had been expecting an assault. The firefighters, now on high alert, moved cautiously from room to room, their heavy boots crunching on fallen plaster. Frank followed, his flashlight beam trembling. Inside the rooms, the scene was even more bizarre. The old metal frame beds were stripped bare, but on each dusty desk sat a glass of water. The glasses were half full, and a delicate layer of fresh frost coated their surfaces, sparkling in the flashlight beams. The water inside was not frozen, but it was slushy with ice crystals. Despite the fact that the building's heating had been off for years, and the ambient temperature inside was well above freezing, it was as if each glass was generating its own localized pocket of intense cold. The fire captain checked a window, confirming it was sealed shut, caulked and painted over years ago. There was no draft. "What the hell is this?" one of the younger firefighters whispered, his voice barely audible over the screaming alarm. They found no fire, no squatters, no signs of forced entry other than the main door they had just breached. The building was empty, a time capsule of dust and silence, inexplicably rearranged by an unseen hand. The alarm panel on the third-floor landing showed the source of the problem. Multiple manual pull stations along the hallway had been activated. The small glass rods were broken, and the levers were pulled down. The fire captain reset the system, and the piercing alarm finally fell silent. The sudden quiet was more unnerving than the noise had been. In the silence, they could hear the faint, rhythmic dripping of water somewhere deep within the building's walls. Frank and the fire crew stood in the dark, cold hallway, the beams of their flashlights crisscrossing over the frosted glasses and the barricade of mattresses. The logic of the situation had completely unraveled. There was no one in the building to pull the alarms. There was no source for the intense cold that had frosted the glasses. There was no explanation for the beds being dragged into the hall. The fire captain, a man of immense practicality, could only shake his head. "We'll log it as a malicious false alarm," he said, his voice lacking its usual conviction. "Probably kids who found another way in and out." But they all knew that was a lie. They had checked every window, every possible access point. The building was a fortress, and the snow on the ground outside had been undisturbed. As the fire crew left, Frank was left alone to chain the doors again. He stood for a long moment, looking back into the black maw of the dormitory. and felt a profound sense of being watched. He could almost hear the faint echoes of whispers, the rustle of movement from the empty rooms. He secured the chain, the metallic rattle sounding small and insignificant against the immense, waiting silence of the building. He never went back into the North Wing. The Sitka Fire Department alarm report from that night in March 2002 is a document of quiet contradiction. It notes a false alarm, likely malicious, but also includes a strange addendum mentioning unexplained rearrangement of contents and anomalous temperature drops. It's an official record of an event that defied official explanation, a quiet testament to the fact that even when a building is empty, it is not always uninhabited. Echoes on the pipeline. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline is an 800-mile artery of steel, a monumental feat of engineering snaking through one of the world's most hostile environments. For the security guards who patrol it, the job is one of profound isolation and vigilance. They are the solitary sentinels of this vital lifeline, their world a monotonous landscape of snow, steel, and sky. In December of 2014, at a remote pump station deep in the interior, that monotony was shattered for a guard named James Corbin. James was a former military police officer, a man accustomed to long, quiet shifts and trained to observe details others might miss. His post was a small, heavily insulated security shack, equipped with a bank of monitors displaying feeds from thermal imaging cameras, positioned along his section of the pipeline. On a typical minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit night, the thermal view was a predictable one. The pipeline itself glowed with a faint, ghostly heat, while the surrounding wilderness was a canvas of deep, cold blues and purples. The only signs of life were the occasional bright flare of a snowshoe hare or an Arctic fox skittering across the snow. The anomaly began just after 2 a.m. On camera 7, which monitored a long, straight stretch of the pipeline running through a wide, open valley, James saw movement. It wasn't an animal. The thermal signature was tall, upright, and unmistakably human in shape. Then he saw another, and another, until there were 5 distinct figures moving near the pipeline. His training kicked in instantly. A breach was a serious threat. He zoomed the camera in, trying to get a clearer image, but the figures were just shimmering, man-shaped pillars of heat against the intense cold. They moved with a strange, jerky gait, pacing back and forth along the pipeline in a synchronized, unnatural pattern. They wore no discernible cold weather gear, which was impossible. At 30 below, exposed skin would suffer frostbite in minutes. No one could survive out there dressed like that. He immediately dispatched a patrol vehicle, a heavy-duty truck equipped for the harsh conditions. He kept his eyes glued to the monitor, guiding the patrol toward the location. As the truck's headlights appeared in the distance on the thermal feed, the figures simply vanished. They didn't run or hide. They just winked out of existence all at once, as if they had never been there. The patrol arrived minutes later and found nothing. The snow around the pipeline was a perfect, unbroken sheet. There were no footprints, no tracks, no sign that anyone had been within miles of the location. James's supervisor, a skeptical man named Harris, reviewed the security log. He dismissed the incident as a thermal ghost, a known glitch where heat from underground vents or machinery could be misread by the cameras as a living figure, especially in extreme cold. James accepted the explanation, but a seed of doubt was planted. The figures had seemed too deliberate, too coordinated to be a simple glitch. The next night, they appeared again. Same time, same camera, same synchronized, jerky movements. This time, James didn't dispatch a patrol right away. He just watched, his heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He recorded the feed, documenting their strange, silent patrol. He watched them for nearly an hour as they paced in unison, their thermal forms shimmering against the frozen landscape. Then, he sent the truck, and just like the night before, the moment the patrol vehicle came into view, the figures vanished, leaving behind only the undisturbed snow. This pattern continued for a week. Every night, the figures would appear. Every night, James would record them. And every night, they would disappear the moment a physical presence approached. Harris, the supervisor, was growing annoyed, convinced James was chasing shadows. But the recordings were undeniable. On the 8th night, something changed. As James watched the figures on the monitor, he noticed a new element. The camera feed began to degrade, lines of static flickering across the screen. The closer he guided the approaching patrol truck, the worse the static became, until the entire screen dissolved into a blizzard of white noise just as the truck arrived at the location. When the truck retreated, the feed cleared, revealing the empty, snow-covered pipeline. It was as if the figures, or whatever was creating them, were actively interfering with the surveillance equipment. James was now convinced this was no glitch. He spent hours reviewing the footage from the past week, comparing the recordings night after night. He discovered something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The movements of the figures were not just similar each night, they were identical. Their pacing, the turn of a head, the slight hesitation at a specific point along the pipe. It was a perfect loop, a ghostly recording playing out in the thermal spectrum. He presented his findings to Harris, who could no longer dismiss the evidence. They logged the events as an unexplained and recurring electronic anomaly. The Alaska Pipeline Security Service sent a team of technicians to inspect Camera 7. They found the equipment to be in perfect working order. They replaced the camera, the wiring, and the transmitters. But the phantom figures continued to appear on the new equipment for another 2 nights. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The monitors showed nothing but the cold, empty wilderness. The incident was officially closed, the cause listed as inconclusive. But James Corbin was never the same. He had witnessed something that operated outside the known rules of his world. They were echoes, he thought, a memory of people trapped in the cold, their spectral heat signature forever replaying a silent, endless patrol along the cold steel of the pipeline. The security log from that December is a strange document, a clinical and detached description of an impossible event. It's a record of figures that left no footprints, of a patrol that had no substance, a chilling reminder that in the vast, silent landscapes of the far north, some things leave an impression that can only be seen when you look for the heat of a ghost. The ferry car deck. The Alaska Marine Highway is more than a ferry system. It's a lifeline for the coastal communities of the state's southeast panhandle. The vessels are sturdy, no-nonsense ships, built to handle the unpredictable waters of the Inside Passage. For the crew, life aboard is a routine of departures and arrivals, of loading and unloading, of the constant thrum of the engines. Mike Jensen was a vehicle loader, a job he'd held for a decade. He was a master of a chaotic form of Tetris, directing cars, trucks, and RVs into the tight confines of the ferry's car deck with a series of sharp whistles and emphatic hand signals. He knew every inch of the cavernous, steel-walled space. In August of 1989, aboard the MV Taku, that familiar space became the stage for an event that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a late-night sailing out of Ketchikan, heading north. The loading had been routine. Mike and his team had packed the deck tight. the vehicles arranged in neat, close rows under the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights. Once the last car was in place and the massive stern door was sealed, Mike did his final walkthrough, checking his log to ensure the vehicle count matched the manifest. Everything was in order. He secured the hatches and went up to the crew's mess for a late dinner. The familiar vibration of the ship's engines a comforting presence as it pulled away from the dock and into the dark, choppy waters. About an hour into the voyage, a car alarm began to blare from the car deck. It was an annoying but not uncommon occurrence. Changes in pressure or the rocking of the ship could sometimes trigger sensitive alarms. The boatswain radioed down, asking Mike to identify the vehicle and see if the owner could be paged to disable it. Mike grabbed his keys in the deck log and headed below. The car deck was a different world when the ship was underway. The bright lights were dimmed, and the space was filled with the deep, resonant hum of the engines and the rhythmic creak of steel. The alarm was a shrill, piercing counterpoint to the ship's low groan. It was coming from Section C, Lane 4. Mike consulted his log. According to his own careful records, Lane 4 was empty. He'd left it clear as a fire lane, a standard procedure on a full sailing. He frowned, assuming he'd made a rare clerical error. He walked toward the sound, his flashlight beam cutting through the dim, cavernous space. The alarm was deafening now, echoing off the steel walls. It was definitely coming from the middle of Lane 4, but as his light swept across the spot, it revealed nothing but empty, painted steel deck. There was no car. Mike stood there, bewildered, the alarm screaming from a point in empty space right in front of him. He spun around, shining his light down the adjacent lanes, thinking the sound was playing tricks on him, bouncing off the other vehicles. But the sound was localized, its source undeniably the empty spot in Lane 4. He could almost feel the vibrations in the air. A cold, creeping fear began to replace his confusion. He called the bridge, his voice strained. "You're not going to believe this," he said, "but the alarm is coming from an empty slot. There's no vehicle here." The boatswain, a man not given to flights of fancy, told him to double-check. Mike walked the entire section again, his light probing the shadows between bumpers and undercarriages. Lane 4 was empty, yet the alarm continued its frantic, piercing cry. For over an hour, the phantom alarm echoed through the car deck. Passengers on the decks above began to complain about the noise. The crew was at a loss. They couldn't silence an alarm on a car that didn't exist. Mike stayed on the car deck, drawn by a morbid fascination. He began to notice other details. The air around the source of the sound felt colder, and on the deck itself, in the empty lane, he saw something his flashlight had missed before. Wet tire tracks. They were faint but unmistakable, leading from the stern of the ship into the middle of Lane 4 and stopping exactly where the alarm seemed to be originating. It looked as if a car had driven aboard, parked, and then simply vanished. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the alarm stopped. The silence that rushed in was profound, broken only by the steady thrum of the engines. Mike stood in the middle of the now quiet car deck, the hair on his arms standing on end. He felt watched. He felt a presence in the cold air that hadn't been there before. He retreated from the deck, securing the hatch behind him as if locking a monster in a cage. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was sealing a tomb. When the ferry docked in Wrangell the next morning, the first thing Mike did was review the security log and the passenger manifest with the purser. There were no unaccounted for vehicles. No passengers had reported a missing car. His own deck log, the one he had filled out with his own hand, confirmed that Lane 4 was supposed to be empty. The wet tire tracks had evaporated overnight, leaving no trace. The incident was logged in the ferry's official incident report as a probable electrical malfunction in the ship's PA system causing an auditory anomaly. It was a tidy, bureaucratic explanation for something that felt profoundly untidy and deeply unnatural. Mike Jensen continued to work on the ferries for another 15 years, but he was never comfortable on the car deck alone at night again. He would always pause before entering Section C, listening for a sound that wasn't there, half expecting to see a faint pair of wet tracks appear on the steel floor. The incident report from that voyage in August 1989 still sits in an archive, a single page in a thick binder of maritime records. It's a footnote in the long history of the Alaska Marine Highway, a brief, official account of a phantom car that cried for help for over an hour before disappearing back into the silence from which it came. The snowfield line. In the vast flat tundra of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, the world is reduced to two elements: the endless white of the snow and the immense gray of the sky. It's a landscape that can swallow a person whole, a place where the scale of nature makes human endeavor seem small and fragile. For linemen like Tom Walsh, who worked for the Alaska Energy Authority, this landscape was their office. Their job was to maintain the skeletal steel towers and the high-voltage lines that carried power to the remote villages scattered across the tundra, a task that was often a brutal fight against ice, wind, and profound isolation. In the winter of 2000, Tom was tasked with investigating reports of arcing on a remote stretch of the transmission line near the village of Bethel. Arcing was a serious issue, where electricity jumped from the line to the tower or into the air, often caused by damaged insulators or heavy ice buildup. It could lead to power outages and equipment failure. The reports were coming from bush pilots who had seen strange flashes of blue light around the towers during their flights. The problem was, the section of line in question was inaccessible by ground in the winter. The tundra was a frozen marsh, impassable even for snowmobiles. The only way to inspect the towers was by helicopter. Tom and his pilot, a steady hand named Dave, took off from Bethel on a clear, brutally cold morning. The landscape below was a featureless expanse of white, broken only by the dark, geometric line of the transmission towers marching single file toward the horizon. As they approached the designated area, Tom saw it immediately. A bright, silent flash of blue-white light erupted from the crossbar of a distant tower, a visual scream in the silent landscape. "There it is," Dave said over the headset, his voice calm. "You see that?" Tom nodded, already focusing the lens of his high-powered camera. "Get me closer." Dave expertly maneuvered the helicopter, circling the massive steel structure. As they got nearer, the strangeness of the situation became apparent. The snow around the base of the tower was a perfect, undisturbed blanket. There were no access tracks, no footprints, no sign of any maintenance vehicle or person having been there for months. And yet, the flashes continued, sporadic and intense. Tom snapped photos, zooming in on the insulators and the lines themselves. Through the lens, he could see no visible damage. The insulators were intact. The lines were taut and clear of any significant ice buildup that would explain such a powerful discharge. He had Dave circle the next tower in the line, and the one after that. They all showed the same thing: sporadic, brilliant arcing with no discernible cause, and no tracks in the snow below. They flew the entire 10-mile stretch, and on nearly every tower, They witnessed the same phantom flashes of light. It was as if the electricity was simply leaking into the air for no reason. Back in Bethel, Tom developed the photographs, hoping they would reveal some detail he had missed. As the images emerged from the chemical bath, a cold dread washed over him, colder than any Arctic wind. The pictures showed the towers, the lines, the vast white snowfield, but clinging to the steel crossbars of the towers, right where the arcing had occurred, were shapes. They were dark, indistinct, and vaguely humanoid, like shadows that had been given a third dimension. They were wrapped around the steel beams, their forms contorted and unnatural. In one photo, a shape seemed to be reaching for the high voltage line. In another, a cluster of them huddled together near an insulator. They had no discernible features, just a deep, light-absorbing blackness that stood in stark contrast to the snow and steel. Tom stared at the photos, his rational mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Ice formations? A trick of the light, but the shapes were too consistent, too deliberate. He flipped to the next photo in the sequence, taken just seconds after the first. The shape was gone. The crossbar was empty. He checked the other photos. It was the same pattern. A frame would show the shadow-like form clinging to the tower, and the very next frame, taken moments later, would show nothing but bare steel. They were there, and then they were not. He showed the photos to his supervisor, who stared at them in silence for a long time. The official explanation they settled on was a severe corona effect caused by blowing ice crystals, creating anomalous shapes in the photographs. It was a plausible, scientific-sounding theory that explained everything and nothing at all. But Tom knew what he had seen, both with his eyes and through the lens of his camera. He had seen things feeding on the power, things that left no tracks and could vanish in the blink of an eye. The arcing stopped a week later, as mysteriously as it had begun. The maintenance memo filed with the Alaska Energy Authority in January 2000 is a dry, technical document. It recommends further study into the effects of cryo-aerodynamic particulates on high-voltage transmission equipment. Tom Walsh refused the assignment. He requested a transfer to a division that worked on urban grids, away from the vast, empty spaces. He never wanted to fly over that snowfield line again. Never wanted to risk getting a clearer picture of the dark things that clung to the towers, feasting on the light. The cold room, the Elmer Rasmussen Library at the University of Alaska Fairbanks is a sanctuary of knowledge, its halls filled with the quiet rustle of turning pages and the hushed whispers of students. But deep in its climate-controlled heart, in the archival vault known as the Cold Room, a different kind of story was being written, one that had nothing to do with academic research. The Cold Room housed the university's most precious and fragile collections, rare books, historical photographs, and priceless ethnographic artifacts. It was a place of meticulous order, where temperature and humidity were monitored with scientific precision. In November of 1993, a young archivist named Liam Casey was assigned to oversee the vault's environmental systems. Liam was a detail-oriented person, a man who found comfort in data and spreadsheets. His job was to ensure the stability of the collection's environment, a task he approached with a quiet, scholarly dedication. The problem began with the dehumidifiers. Every morning, when Liam checked the overnight data logs, he found a recurring anomaly. At precisely 3:11 a.m., the humidity readings from the sensors in aisle 4 would spike dramatically, triggering the dehumidifiers to run at maximum capacity for exactly 30 minutes before returning to normal. This was happening every single night. Liam's first thought was an equipment malfunction. He replaced the sensors in aisle 4. The spikes continued. He had the HVAC technicians inspect the entire system. They found nothing wrong. He placed a secondary, independent data logger in the aisle. It confirmed the readings from the main system. The humidity was genuinely, inexplicably spiking in that one aisle, at that one time, every night. Aisle 4 was where the Northern Exploration collection was stored, a series of leather-bound journals and logbooks from 19th century expeditions, many of which had ended in tragedy. The aisle was narrow, lined with tall, rolling shelves, packed with the silent testimonies of men who had vanished into the Arctic ice. The air in that particular aisle always seemed colder than the rest of the vault. The silence deeper. Frustrated and determined to find a logical explanation, Liam requested that a security camera be temporarily installed at the end of aisle 4. He wanted to see what was happening at 3:11 a.m. The first night's recording showed nothing out of the ordinary. The aisle was empty, silent, and still. But as he watched the footage, right around the 3:11 mark, he saw it. It was subtle. So subtle he almost missed it. The heavy, steel shelves on the left side of the aisle vibrated slightly, a tremor that lasted for only a few seconds. It was as if someone very heavy had walked past them, their footfalls shaking the concrete floor. But there were no footfalls. The aisle remained empty. Liam watched the footage over and over, his professional curiosity slowly twisting into a knot of fear. The next night, the camera captured the same vibration, this time accompanied by a new phenomenon, a faint, shimmering mist, visible only because it slightly distorted the view of the shelves behind it, drifted slowly down the aisle before dissipating. The dehumidifiers kicked on at the exact same moment. The data was irrefutable, but the conclusion was impossible. The vault was a sealed room, accessible only by a single keycard-protected door. The access logs showed no one had entered the vault during those hours. Liam began to dread his morning routine of checking the logs. The data felt less like scientific readings and more like the vital signs of something unseen. The staff who worked in the archives began to notice the strangeness as well. People refused to go into the cold room alone, especially at night. They spoke of a feeling of being watched, of the sudden, inexplicable chill in aisle 4. One student assistant quit after claiming she heard the faint, dry rustle of pages turning when she was the only one in the vault. Liam, a man of science and reason, was being pushed to the edge of his understanding. He set up a final experiment. He placed a series of highly sensitive thermometers at intervals down aisle 4 and let the camera run for one more night. The next morning, he reviewed the data with a sense of grim finality. At 3:11 a.m., as the phantom mist appeared on camera and the shelves vibrated, the temperature charts registered a sudden, localized plunge. While the rest of the vault remained at a stable 50 degrees, the thermometers in the middle of aisle 4 dropped to below freezing for several minutes before climbing back to normal. It was a pocket of impossible cold, a physical manifestation of the presence that haunted the aisle. Liam took his findings, the data logs, the video footage, the temperature charts, to his department head. He presented it all in a calm, factual manner, a scientist reporting on an experiment. The department head, a pragmatic historian, listened patiently. The official response was to decommission aisle 4. The collection was moved to another part of the vault. The aisle was sealed off with a temporary wall. The problem, it seemed, was not with the equipment, but with the location itself. The nightly humidity spikes stopped. The UAF facility's climate control log from November 1993 contains a series of bizarre entries about unexplained hygrometric and thermal fluctuations in the archival vault, followed by a work order to isolate and bypass Aisle 4 environmental controls. It's a bureaucratic paper trail that hints at a story far stranger than any of the expedition journals stored on its shelves. Liam Casey requested a different position within the library system shortly thereafter. He had spent his career trying to preserve the past, but he had encountered a piece of the past that was not content to remain quiet on the shelf. The abandoned trapper line. The Alaskan bush in February is a world of brutal simplicity. Life is stripped down to the essentials of warmth, food, and survival. For the state's game wardens, it is a time of long, cold patrols, checking on registered trap lines and ensuring the rules of the wild are being followed. Warden Mark Bishop was a man perfectly suited to this life. He was patient, observant, and possessed a deep, unsentimental respect for the unforgiving landscape he called his office. In the winter of 1981, while on a solo snowmobile patrol outside of Kotzebue, he stumbled upon a mystery that defied the simple, harsh logic of the wilderness. He was checking the registry for a trap line that belonged to an old Inupiaq trapper named Silas Kanayurak. According to the records, the line hadn't been active for 2 years. Silas had passed away in the winter of '79. A quiet end to a long life lived on the land. His traps should have been rusted shut, his small wilderness cabin slowly surrendering to the snow. Bishop was making a routine check to ensure the line was truly dormant before reassigning the territory. As he followed the old, familiar trail, he saw the first sign that something was wrong. A marten trap, secured to the base of a spruce tree, was not rusted and derelict. It was set. The pan was baited with a fresh piece of salted fish, the bait still glistening with oil, untouched by the ubiquitous camp robber birds. Bishop stopped his machine. The engines rumbled, the only sound in the vast silence. He dismounted, his boots crunching in the dry, squeaky snow. He examined the trap. It was one of Silas's old models, but the mechanism had been recently oiled. This wasn't an old, forgotten trap that had somehow remained set. This was an active trap on a dead man's line. His first thought was of an unregistered trapper, a poacher. It was not uncommon for people to secretly work old, forgotten lines. He followed the trail, a growing sense of unease settling over him. He found another trap, and then another, all freshly baited and set with a skill he recognized as Silas's own. It was as if the old man himself was still working the line. The snowmobile tracks he was following were clear and recent. A single machine had come this way, likely within the last day or two. Bishop followed the tracks, expecting to find a camp, or perhaps the poacher himself. The trail led him deeper into the tundra, away from the sparse tree line and onto the vast, windswept expanse of a frozen lake. And there, in the middle of the lake, the tracks simply stopped. Bishop circled the area on his own machine, his eyes scanning the snow. The tracks led out onto the ice and then ended abruptly. There were no other tracks leading away. No signs of a struggle. No indication that a machine had broken through the ice, which was several feet thick. It was as if the snowmobile and its rider had been plucked straight up into the sky. A cold wind swept across the lake, carrying with it a fine powder of snow. Bishop stood there, next to the impossible end of the trail, and felt a profound sense of wrongness. The wilderness was dangerous, but it was logical. It operated on a set of harsh but understandable rules. This broke all of them. He continued his patrol, following the trapline to its end. He found Silas's old cabin, half buried in a snowdrift. The door was unlocked. Inside, the small, one-room structure was cold and silent, yet eerily tidy. A thin layer of dust covered everything, but there were signs of recent activity. A small stack of firewood was piled neatly by the stove. A tin cup sat on the table. A dark ring of what looked like tea dried at the bottom. In the corner, a pile of fresh spruce boughs, used for their aromatic and insulating properties, lay on the sleeping platform. It was as if someone was preparing the cabin for the winter, or perhaps had just stepped out for a moment. But the air was dead and still, and the cold inside was the deep, permanent cold of a place that had not felt human warmth for a very long time. Bishop found Silas's old journal on a small shelf above the bunk. He opened it, the pages stiff with cold. The entries were written in a mix of English and Inupiaq, detailing the weather, the movement of game, the simple, rhythmic life of a trapper. The last entry was dated 2 days before Silas's official date of death. It was short and cryptic. "The thin place is open again," it read. "The cold walkers are hungry. I will not feed them." Bishop closed the journal, the old man's words echoing in the silent cabin. He didn't understand what they meant, but they filled him with a deep and unsettling fear. He left the cabin, securing the door behind him, and drove his snowmobile away as fast as he could. The image of the tracks that ended in the middle of nowhere burned into his mind. Back in Kotzebue, he filed his report. He noted the active traps and the signs of trespassing, but he omitted the part about the snowmobile tracks that led to nothing. He knew no one would believe him. The gear on the line was never claimed. The traps eventually rusted. The bait was taken by animals, and the line fell silent once more. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game Enforcement log for February 1981 contains a brief entry about an unauthorized use of a registered trap line, with the case marked as unresolved. It's a simple, bureaucratic record of a patrol that uncovered something far more complex. For Mark Bishop, it was a permanent reminder that out in the great silent white, there are things that move without leaving tracks, things that still tend the lines of the dead, and that some places are best left alone. The mountain school bus. The job of a school bus driver in a rural Alaskan district is one of immense responsibility. They navigate treacherous mountain roads in all weather, serving as the first and last point of contact in a student's school day. For Earl Thompson, a driver for the Haynesboro School District for over 30 years, it was a job he took with quiet pride. He knew every curve of his route, every pothole, and the name of every child who climbed his bus's steep steps. He was a steady, reliable man, a fixed point in the lives of the families who lived scattered in the remote valleys outside of town. One misty September morning in 2016, Earl's predictable world began to unravel. He started his route as he always did, the big yellow bus rumbling to life in the pre-dawn chill. The mountain peaks were shrouded in a thick, damp fog, and a light drizzle slicked the asphalt. At his first stop, a small cabin set back from the road, he saw the 2 elementary school kids, the Miller twins, waiting by their mailbox, their bright raincoats like beacons in the gloom. He swung the door open. They climbed aboard with a cheerful, "Morning, Earl," and he watched them in his big rearview mirror as they took their usual seats. He continued on his route, the bus's interior slowly filling with the quiet chatter of sleepy children. He saw them all. He greeted them by name. Young Sarah from the homestead up the valley, the Johnson brothers from the fishing lodge, High schooler Kevin, who always had his headphones on. He saw them get on the bus. He was sure of it. When he pulled into the school parking lot, he did his final check, walking the length of the bus to make sure no one had left a backpack or a lunchbox behind. The bus was empty. He nodded, satisfied, and went to the driver's lounge to have a cup of coffee before his afternoon route. An hour later, the school principal found him, her face a mask of confusion and concern. "Earl," she said, her voice tight, "none of your students are here. We've been calling their parents. They all say they watched them get on your bus this morning." Earl stared at her, the coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. "That's impossible," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I saw them. They were all on the bus. I dropped them off right here." The principal led him to the main office. The school's attendance record was a long list of absences. Every single student from Earl's route marked as missing. A cold, nauseating feeling began to spread through Earl's chest. He had seen them. He had talked to them. Had he imagined it all? Was he losing his mind? The school district immediately launched an investigation. They checked the bus's onboard camera system, a new addition that year. The footage from that morning was corrupted. The recording started normally, showing Earl starting the bus, but a minute into the route, it dissolved into a screen of pixelated static. It remained that way for the entire duration of the trip, clearing up only as the bus pulled into the school's parking lot. The bus's GPS log was the next piece of evidence they examined. The data was bizarre. It showed that Earl's bus had indeed traveled its correct route. More than that, it showed the bus had paused at every single designated stop for exactly 3 minutes, the standard time allotted for student boarding. The GPS had logged a perfect, by-the-book run, a run that should have resulted in a bus full of children. But according to the school, the bus had arrived empty. The Haynesboro police were called in. They interviewed Earl for hours. He recounted the morning in painstaking detail, describing the kids' conversations, what they were wearing, everything. He was adamant. The children had been on his bus. The police, suspecting a bizarre prank or something far more sinister, retraced the entire route, stopping at each house. The story was the same everywhere. The parents had watched their children board the bus. They had seen the door close and the bus drive away. No other vehicles had been on the road. The children had simply vanished somewhere between their front doors and the school. Panic began to grip the small community. Search parties were organized. The story hit the local news. For hours, the town was locked in a state of terrified confusion. Then, just before noon, the school started receiving calls. One by one, the parents were calling in, their voices a mix of relief and utter bewilderment. Their children had just walked through the front door of their homes. They were safe, but their stories made no sense. Each child claimed the same thing. They had gotten on the bus, but instead of taking them to school, Earl had driven the entire route in reverse, dropping each of them off back at their own stops. They said he hadn't spoken a word the entire time, just stared straight ahead at the road. When questioned again, Earl was horrified. He swore he had driven directly to the school. He remembered the conversations, the normal morning routine. He had no memory of turning the bus around, of driving the route in reverse. His memory of the morning was completely at odds with the collective memory of every child on his route. The investigation hit a dead end. The camera was broken. The GPS showed a normal route. The children were all safe, but their account of the morning directly contradicted the driver's. The Haynesboro School District transportation log from that day is a strange document. It shows Bus 7, driven by Earl Thompson, completing its morning route on schedule. An addendum, stapled to the back, details the unexplained mass student absence and subsequent safe return, citing a critical discrepancy between driver and passenger testimony. Earl Thompson was placed on administrative leave and eventually took an early retirement. He could never reconcile his memory of that morning with what the children said had happened. He was left with an impossible question. Had he been the sole occupant of a phantom bus full of ghost children? Or had he been the silent, unknowing chauffeur for a bus full of real children on a journey he couldn't remember? Either way, the familiar yellow school bus, once a symbol of routine and safety, became for him a vessel of profound and terrifying mystery. The research barge, the Chukchi Sea in late winter, is a hostile and alien world, a moving jigsaw puzzle of sea ice that groans and shifts under a perpetually twilight sky. For a team of oceanographers aboard the research barge Arctic Tern, it was a place of immense scientific interest. They were studying underwater acoustics, using sensitive hydrophones to listen to the sounds of marine mammals beneath the ice pack. Lily Tran, a graduate student on her first Arctic expedition, was in charge of monitoring the hydrophone feeds. Her job was to sit in a small, warm electronics lab, staring at spectrograms on a screen and listening through headphones to the symphony of the deep. The clicks of whales, the groans of shifting ice, and the eerie, descending whistles of bearded seals. For weeks, the work had been fascinating and predictable. Then, one night, in March of 2017, the sea began to speak in a new voice. It started as a faint, rhythmic sound on the deepest hydrophone array. The one dangled 1,000 feet beneath the barge's hull. It was a knocking sound. 3 sharp taps, a pause, then 3 more. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Lily at first dismissed it as an echo from their own ship's machinery, or perhaps the sound of a large piece of ice repeatedly striking the hull. But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It had a cadence that felt artificial. She isolated the audio feed, filtering out the background noise of the ocean. The knocking became clearer, sharper. It was undeniably coming from directly beneath them. She called in the lead scientist, Dr. Aris Thorne, a man with decades of experience in polar environments. He listened to the audio, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's not ice," he said, his voice low. "Ice groans and cracks. It doesn't knock." For the next 3 hours, they listened as the knocking continued, its rhythm unwavering. They checked every piece of equipment on the barge. All systems were stable. No machinery was making a corresponding sound. They were frozen into the ice pack, miles from any other vessel. The sound was coming from the water, from the crushing black deep beneath them. The next night, it happened again, at almost the same time. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. This time, the team decided to investigate. They deployed a remotely operated vehicle, a small submersible drone equipped with a camera and powerful lights, sending it down into the darkness to find the source of the sound. Lily watched the ROV's camera feed on a large monitor, a knot of anticipation and fear in her stomach. The drone descended through the water column, its lights cutting a cone of visibility through the inky blackness. The screen showed nothing but the slow drift of marine snow and the occasional ghostly shape of a jellyfish. As the ROV approached the depth of the hydrophone, the knocking sound on the audio feed grew louder, more immediate. It was right there with them, But the camera showed nothing, just empty, black water in every direction. They panned the camera around, a full 360-degree sweep. Nothing. The ROV's own sonar, which should have been able to detect any solid object nearby, showed the area was completely clear. Yet the knocking persisted, so loud now it felt like it was coming from inside the lab itself. They were recording a sound with no source. For 3 consecutive nights, the phenomenon repeated itself. The rhythmic knocking would begin after sundown and cease just before dawn. The crew grew increasingly unnerved. The vast, empty wilderness around them no longer felt empty. They were isolated, a tiny island of warmth and light in a world of ice and darkness, and something was trying to get their attention from below. Sleep became difficult. Every creak of the barge's hull, every groan of the shifting ice, sounded like the beginning of that terrible, rhythmic tapping. On the 4th day, the icebreaker that was scheduled to support their expedition arrived, its powerful engines shattering the silence and breaking up the ice pack around the barge. The moment the icebreaker came within a 5-mile radius, the knocking stopped. It never returned. The team packed up their equipment, their scientific mission overshadowed by the unexplained acoustic event. Back at their university, the audio recordings were analyzed by experts. They confirmed that the sound was not biological, not geological, and not mechanical in any known sense. The sequence of taps was too consistent to be random. Some analysts even suggested it resembled a primitive form of coded communication, though its meaning was impossible to decipher. The official NOAA hydrophone log from the expedition in March 2017 contains the recordings, archived under the label Unidentified Sub-Ice Acoustic Event. The tapes are a chilling record of a conversation with a ghost, a series of questions tapped out from the crushing pressure of the deep, with no one and nothing there to ask them. Lily Tran completed her doctorate, but she changed the focus of her research. She no longer wanted to listen to the sounds of the deep. She couldn't shake the feeling that sometimes, in the great and terrible silence of the abyss, something might just decide to answer back. The dead airfield. Some places are soaked in memory, the echoes of the past clinging to them like morning fog. The abandoned World War II airstrip near Yakutat was one of those places. It was a relic, a series of cracked concrete runways being slowly reclaimed by alder trees and coastal grasses, a monument to a conflict that had long since faded from living memory. In July of 1985, an FAA inspector named George Prentice was sent to survey the old field. The government was considering reclaiming the land, and George's job was to assess the condition of the remaining infrastructure and formally decommission the site. George was a by-the-book kind of guy, a man who dealt in measurements, regulations, and the hard facts of engineering. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. He spent the first day walking the length of the main runway, taking notes and photographs. The place was desolate, the silence broken only by the cry of gulls and the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. The old control tower was a skeletal wreck, its windows long since shattered. The barracks had collapsed into piles of rotting timber. It was a ghost of a place, but for George, it was just another job site. As evening approached, he set up a small camp near his truck at the edge of the airfield. He was planning to finish his survey the next morning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked concrete, he saw something that made him stop. At the far end of the runway, a faint blue light began to glow, then another, and another, until a perfect, symmetrical line of runway lights was shimmering in the twilight. George stared, his logical mind racing for an explanation. He knew for a fact that the power to this entire site had been cut for over 30 years. The electrical conduits were severed, the transformers looted for copper long ago. There was no source of power. He grabbed a pair of binoculars from his truck. The lights were real. They weren't bright, but they cast a soft, ethereal blue glow, exactly where the runway edge lights would have been. He thought perhaps it was some kind of phosphorescence, a chemical reaction in the old paint. It was a stretch, but it was the only rational explanation he could conjure. Then he heard it. A low, droning sound, like the hum of a distant engine. It grew steadily louder, resolving into the unmistakable sound of radial aircraft engines, the kind that powered the old bombers and transport planes of the war. He scanned the sky, but it was empty. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. There was no radar contact. His portable radio confirmed that. No aircraft were scheduled to be in this airspace. The drone grew into a deafening roar, as if a squadron of invisible planes was passing directly overhead. The wind picked up, whipping the grass around him into a frenzy. George dropped to one knee, his hands over his ears, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound was a physical presence, a vibration that he could feel deep in his bones. It was the sound of a place's memory replaying itself at full volume. He fumbled for his camera, snapping a picture of the glowing runway lights, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The camera's flash seemed to trigger something. The propeller noise cut out abruptly, plunging the airfield back into an unnerving silence. And one by one, the blue runway lights winked out, leaving him alone in the encroaching darkness. George didn't sleep that night. He sat in his truck, the doors locked, watching the empty runway, his mind replaying the impossible sounds and sights. He felt like an intruder, a trespasser in a place that was still very much occupied. The next morning, he went to inspect the runway lights. The old fixtures were there, rusted and broken, their glass lenses shattered. There was no sign of any phosphorescent paint or any other chemical that could have caused the glow. They were just dead, inert objects. He packed up his camp and left Yakutat that same day, cutting his survey short. When he developed the film from his camera, the photograph he had taken of the runway was a mess of overexposed light flares and strange, distorted shadows. The blue lights were visible, but they were blurred and indistinct, like ghostly thumbprints on the image. His official report to the FAA was concise and professional. He recommended against any development of the site, citing unstable ground and potential environmental contaminants. He made no mention of the lights or the phantom engines. He knew it would ruin his career. The FAA inspection memo from July 1985 is a brief, unremarkable document that officially closed the file on the Yakutat airfield. But George Prentice never forgot what he experienced. He had stood on a runway that had briefly woken from a long sleep, its ghost lights guiding a squadron of phantom planes toward a landing that would never come. He understood then that some places are not just locations on a map. They are wounds in time, and sometimes if you stand there long enough, you can still feel them bleed. The Frozen Library. The Juneau Public Library was a modern building, a place of quiet warmth and order against the city's perpetual backdrop of rain and fog. For Hector Ramirez, a night janitor, it was a peaceful place to work. After the last librarian locked up and went home, the building was his. He moved through the silent, empty halls, the rhythmic squeak of his mop and the low hum of the floor buffer, the only sounds in the sleeping building. He liked the solitude, the sense of being the sole guardian of thousands of sleeping stories. In the winter of 2004, a strange and unsettling story began to unfold in the library's nonfiction wing, a story that Hector would become an unwilling character in. It started in the history section. One morning, the day shift librarian found a small pool of water on the floor, seemingly appearing from nowhere. She assumed it was a leaky roof or a problem with the HVAC system. Hector was asked to keep an eye on it. That night, he paid special attention to the area. The ceiling was dry, the windows were sealed tight, and the complex climate control system was humming along perfectly. There was no source for a leak. The next morning, the puddle was back, larger this time. A few days later, the phenomenon escalated. A librarian reshelving books in the history section let out a small cry of surprise. She pulled 2 books from the shelf, a thick biography of Abraham Lincoln and a history of the Civil War, and found that they were fused together by a thin, clear layer of ice. The pages were stiff, the covers sparkling with frost. This was deeply unsettling. The reading room was kept at a constant, comfortable 70 degrees. The humidity was strictly controlled. There was no physical way for ice to form inside the building. The director of facilities was called in. He brought a team of HVAC technicians who spent a full day crawling through the ductwork, checking the thermostats, and running diagnostics on the climate control system. Their report was definitive. The system was functioning perfectly. There were no cold drafts, no malfunctioning units, no explanation for the spontaneous formation of ice. The library staff began to grow uneasy. The nonfiction wing, once a quiet place of study, now felt wrong. People spoke of sudden, inexplicable cold spots, of a feeling of being watched from the ends of the tall, shadowy aisles. Hector, who spent more time in the empty building than anyone, began to notice things too. He would hear faint sounds from the history section after he had already cleaned and locked it for the night. The soft thump of a book being placed on a shelf, the dry rustle of a turning page. He would investigate, his heart pounding, only to find the aisle empty and silent, the air unnervingly cold. The library director, a pragmatic woman who believed in evidence, ordered a security camera to be placed overlooking the affected aisle. She hoped to catch a prankster or discover a subtle environmental cause they had missed. Hector was there when they reviewed the first night's footage. For hours, the camera showed nothing but the silent, still aisle of books. Then, at 2:13 a.m., it happened. A faint, shimmering mist, like visible cold, began to drift into the frame from the far end of the aisle. It swirled slowly around the shelves, clinging to the books like a phantom fog. It had no discernible source. It simply appeared, drifted through the aisle for several minutes, and then dissipated into nothing. The timecode on the video corresponded exactly to when the facilities log showed a sudden, unexplained temperature drop in that specific zone's sensor. Hector felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He was watching a ghost. A ghost made of pure cold. He continued to work, but his peaceful solitude was shattered. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden shape. Every creak of the building sounded like a footstep. He started avoiding the nonfiction wing altogether, cleaning the rest of the library first and saving that section for the very end of his shift. Rushing through the task with his back pressed against the shelves, his ears straining against the silence. The final straw came a week later. He was buffing the floor in the main atrium, the sound of the machine loud in the empty building. Over the hum of the buffer, he heard it, clearly and unmistakably. A woman's voice, whispering from the direction of the history section. It wasn't words, just a soft, sibilant sound. A lonely, sorrowful sigh that cut through the noise of the machine and seemed to curl around his heart. He shut off the buffer. The silence that followed was absolute. He stood frozen for a long moment, listening. The whisper came again, closer this time. He didn't wait to hear it a third time. He left his equipment where it was, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the Juneau Public Library, never to return. He called his supervisor the next day and resigned, citing only personal reasons. The city facilities log from February 2004 has a work order to permanently decommission and seal the HVAC vents in the nonfiction wing due to persistent and unresolvable condensation issues. The strange cold spots and the icy books stopped after that, but the story of the frozen library became a quiet legend among the staff, a whispered tale about the night janitor who heard the library sigh and the cold ghost that haunted the history aisle. The harbor log, the harbor master's office in Petersburg, Alaska, is a small, cluttered room with a large window overlooking the bustling boat harbor. From this perch, harbor master Stan Jorgensen watched the ceaseless comings and goings of the fishing fleet, the lifeblood of the small coastal town. Stan was a man of routine and meticulous records. His world was one of VHF radio chatter, title charts, and the sacred official harbor entry log, a thick, leather-bound book where every vessel that entered or left the harbor was recorded by hand. In the quiet, pre-dawn hours of a foggy June morning in 1990, a single entry was made in that log that would unravel Stan's orderly world. Stan arrived at his office just before sunrise, a mug of hot coffee in his hand, ready to start his day. He greeted the night shift officer, a young man named Rick, who was finishing up his paperwork. Rick looked tired, but reported a quiet night. No incidents, no late arrivals. Stan nodded, and as was his ritual, he opened the harbor log to review the night's entries. The page was mostly empty, as expected. Then he saw it. An entry logged at 1:13 a.m. The handwriting was Rick's, but it was shaky, almost illegible. It recorded the arrival of a vessel named the Wanderer, with a federal registration number he didn't recognize. Stan frowned. "Rick, what's this?" "You said you had no arrivals." Rick looked over his shoulder at the log, his face paling. I didn't write that," he stammered. "I was in the back making coffee at 1. I didn't see any boat come in." Stan looked from the log to Rick's confused face. The entry was undeniably Rick's handwriting, just messier, as if written in a great hurry or under duress. Stan, a man who trusted his records above all else, was now faced with a record that contradicted his own officer. He decided to check the evidence. He went to the small security office and rewound the VHS tape from the single grainy camera that monitored the harbor entrance. He fast-forwarded to 1:13 a.m. The timestamp appeared in the corner of the screen. The footage showed the harbor entrance shrouded in a thick, patchy fog. The water was calm. He watched intently as the minute ticked over. He saw no boat, no hull, no mast, no wake. But he did see something else. For a period of about 30 seconds, the reflections of the harbor lights on the surface of the water distorted and warped, as if something large and solid was passing over them, blocking the light from above. The ripples on the water changed pattern, moving as if displaced by a hull. But there was no hull. It was the silhouette of a boat, visible only by its effect on the water and light around it. Stan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He rewound the tape and watched it again. The phantom boat was there, a boat-shaped hole in reality passing silently into his harbor. He went back to the logbook, his mind reeling. He decided to run the registration number logged for the Wanderer. He spent the next hour on the phone with the Coast Guard and federal maritime authorities. The answer was the same from everyone. The registration number did not exist. It had never been assigned to any vessel. The boat in his logbook was a ghost, a ship that had never been built. Over the next few days, Stan couldn't shake the incident. He tried to rationalize it. Rick must have been half asleep and written down a number from a dream. The camera footage must have been a trick of the fog and the tide. But the explanations felt thin, unsatisfying. The strangeness escalated a week later. Stan came into his office one morning to find the harbor logbook lying open on his desk. It was open to the page with the entry for the Wanderer. The entry had been altered. The original, shaky handwriting was still there, but now a new line had been added underneath it. In a completely different hand, an elegant, archaic script, unlike anyone's on his staff, were 2 words: cargo delivered. Stan felt a wave of nausea. He questioned everyone who had access to the office. No one admitted to touching the log. He was the one who had locked up the previous night. The office had been secure. The entry was an impossibility, a message from an unseen hand. The incident was the talk of the small harbor staff for a while. A strange ghost story to be whispered on long, quiet night shifts. But with no further incidents, it eventually faded into the background of daily work. Stan Jorgensen, however, never forgot. He started locking the logbook in his desk drawer every night. He found himself scanning the harbor entrance in the fog, half expecting to see the water ripple from an invisible hull. He had spent his life recording the physical, tangible reality of the boats that came and went from his harbor. But one night, a boat that wasn't a boat had slipped past his watch, leaving behind only a phantom entry in a logbook and a chilling 2-word message that hinted at a transaction he could never understand. The Petersburg Harbor entry log from June 1990 still exists, stored in a dusty archive. The strange entry is still there, a testament to a night when the line between the real and the spectral blurred, and something that should not have been was meticulously, impossibly recorded. The signal shack. The Alaska Railroad carves its path through a landscape of raw, untamed beauty, a thin line of steel connecting the state's scattered communities. For the workers who maintain this vital corridor, the job is a constant battle against the elements. In the deep winter south of Talkeetna, this means snow, ice, and a soul-crushing cold that can freeze machinery solid. In January of 2008, a signal maintainer named Frank Keller was sent to investigate a series of malfunctions at a remote signal house designated SH-113. The signal house was a small, windowless concrete blockhouse set beside the tracks, containing the complex electrical relays that controlled the track signals for a 10-mile stretch. The problem was that the signals were showing green, indicating a clear track, when they should have been red. The entire section was under a maintenance shutdown, with a crew replacing a section of track a few miles down the line. A green light was not just a glitch. It was a catastrophic failure waiting to happen. Frank arrived at the location on a high-rail truck, a vehicle that can travel on both roads and rails. The signal shack sat in the middle of a vast, snow-covered expanse, the silence broken only by the wind whistling over the tracks. He expected to find a simple problem: a frozen relay, a shorted wire, something he could diagnose and fix in an hour. He unlocked the heavy steel door of the shack and was met with a blast of frigid air. The interior was colder than the outside, and the reason was immediately apparent. A thick, opaque layer of ice coated everything: the walls, the floor, and the entire breaker panel were entombed in it. It looked as if a pipe had burst and flash frozen, but there were no water pipes in the signal shack. He shone his flashlight on the main breaker panel. The switches were completely encased in ice, fused shut in the on position. There was no physical way to cut the power to the signals from here. This was no ordinary ice buildup. It was a solid, seamless mass, as if the cold itself had condensed and solidified on the equipment. Frank, frustrated and cold, decided to trace the power back to the main junction box a quarter-mile up the track. He would have to cut the power there to make the system safe. As he worked, he couldn't shake the strangeness of the ice. It was perfectly clear, with no trapped air bubbles, and it clung to the electrical components in defiance of the small amount of heat they should have been generating. After shutting down the power, he returned to the shack with a propane torch and a set of heavy tools, ready for the long, arduous task of chipping away the ice. It took him hours. As he worked, freeing the breakers one by one, he felt a growing sense of unease. The silence of the location was oppressive. He had the distinct feeling of being watched, a classic case of nerves from working alone in a remote spot, he told himself. But the feeling persisted, a cold prickle on the back of his neck. Once the panel was clear, he found no obvious cause for the malfunction. The relays all seemed to be in perfect working order. Mystified, he reset the system, and when the power was restored, the signals functioned correctly, displaying a solid red light as they should. He logged the repair as system reset after severe icing event, though he knew that didn't even begin to cover the strangeness of what he had seen. Back at the regional maintenance office, he checked the central system logs for SH-113. What he found made his blood run cold. According to the data, the signals at that location had been logging a green light every evening for the past week, starting at precisely 7:11 p.m. and ending at dawn. This had been happening even before the maintenance shutdown had started. The system had been reporting a clear track every single night, when there was no train scheduled to be on that section of rail. He cross-referenced the logs with the dispatch records. His eyes widened when he saw it. A decade earlier, a freight train, the 711 northbound, had derailed near that exact spot due to a track washout during a spring melt. The crash had been catastrophic. Now, 10 years later, a phantom of that train was apparently still trying to complete its journey, its passage marked by the ghostly green lights of a signal box that seemed to remember it. Frank showed the logs to his supervisor, who, after a long silence, instructed him to file his report and forget what he'd seen. The railroad had no official procedure for dealing with haunted signal boxes. The Alaska Railroad maintenance record for that week in January 2008 is a simple, factual document. It notes the unexplained green signal activations and the unusual ice formation in signal house SH-113. It concludes by stating that the system returned to normal function after being serviced. But for Frank Keller, the event was a chilling glimpse into a world where memory and machinery could intertwine, where a block of ice could hold a ghost, and where a green light could shine in the darkness for a train that would never arrive. The Snowfield Lodge, in the remote wilderness near McCarthy, accessible only by a long, treacherous gravel road or a small bush plane, sat the Kennecott Glacier Lodge. It was a grand, rustic hotel that catered to adventurous tourists seeking a taste of the real Alaska. In the off-season, from late fall to early spring, the lodge was left in the care of a single caretaker. In the winter of 1997, that caretaker was a man named Sam Brewer. Sam was a quiet, self-sufficient man in his 50s, perfectly content with the profound solitude of his job. His duties were simple: keep the pipes from freezing, the snow off the roofs, and the lodge in a state of readiness for the coming season. His only company was the wind and the occasional moose that wandered through the empty parking lot. One afternoon, in early December, Sam was surprised to hear the sound of a bush plane approaching. It was unusual to have a flight this late in the year. He watched from the porch as a small Cessna landed on the packed snow airstrip behind the lodge. The pilot, a man Sam recognized from a local air taxi service, unloaded two large, expensive-looking suitcases and a matching set of ski bags onto the snow. "Got a delivery for your guests," the pilot shouted over the idling engine. The Millers, booked through that fancy travel agency in Anchorage. Sam was confused. The lodge was closed for the season. He had no record of any upcoming guests. "There must be some mistake," Sam said. "We're not open until May." The pilot just shrugged, handed Sam a shipping manifest, and took off again, his plane a disappearing speck against the vast white landscape. Sam was left standing alone on the airstrip with a mountain of luggage for guests who didn't exist. He checked the manifest. The luggage was indeed addressed to a Mr. and Mrs. Miller, care of the lodge. The tracking numbers showed it had been correctly routed from a high-end travel outfitter in Seattle. He hauled the heavy bags into the lodge's empty lobby, the squeak of the luggage wheels echoing in the vast, silent space. He called the travel agency in Anchorage. The agent he spoke to was apologetic but firm. The reservation was in their system. A 2-week, all-inclusive stay for two, paid in full. They were scheduled to arrive on a separate charter flight later that day. Sam spent the rest of the day in a state of confused preparation. He fired up the main generator, turned on the heat in the lodge's finest suite, and prepared a simple welcome dinner, just in case. As evening fell, a heavy snow began to fall, blanketing the wilderness in a fresh layer of white. He waited. He listened for the sound of another plane, but the only sound was the howling of the wind. The Millers never arrived. The next day, Sam called the travel agency again. They were just as baffled. They tried to contact the charter flight company, but could find no record of a flight being booked for the Millers. They tried to contact the clients themselves at the numbers they had on file, but the numbers were disconnected. It was as if Mr. and Mrs. Miller, after meticulously planning and paying for their trip, had simply vanished off the face of the earth. For 2 weeks, the luggage sat untouched in the corner of the lobby, silent monuments to the guests who never were. Sam lived in the empty, heated lodge, a reluctant host for a phantom party. He couldn't shake a strange, unsettling feeling that he wasn't entirely alone. He would catch fleeting movements in the periphery of his vision, hear the faint creak of a floorboard from the floor above, or find a door he had locked standing slightly ajar. He started talking to himself, just to break the oppressive silence. He began to feel like he was the one who was the ghost, haunting the empty halls of a lodge that was waiting for someone else. The travel agency eventually instructed him to have the luggage shipped back to their office in Anchorage. Sam dutifully loaded the pristine, unopened suitcases and ski bags back onto a supply plane. As he watched it fly away, he felt a profound sense of relief, as if a spell had been broken. The lodge closed for the winter shortly after. The owners, citing financial difficulties, decided not to reopen the following season. The building was left to the snow and the silence. The incident logbook from the lodge for December 1997 contains Sam's neat, handwritten entries. It details a strange delivery, the non-arrival of the guests, and the daily, lonely routine of waiting. It is the last entry in the book. The story of the Phantom Guests became a piece of local McCarthy lore, a strange footnote in the history of a failed business. But for Sam Brewer, it was a deeply personal and unsettling experience. He had been the caretaker of a reservation for two people who existed only on paper, their luggage the only proof they had ever planned to step into the real world. He was left to wonder if the Millers had ever been real at all, or if they were just part of a story that had chosen the isolated, snowbound lodge as its final, empty chapter. The ice tunnel, the Juneau ice field, is a breathtaking and treacherous expanse, a 1,500 square mile river of ancient ice flowing between jagged mountain peaks. For a team of university geologists mapping its meltwater channels in the summer of 2012, it was a dynamic and fascinating natural laboratory. Dr. Elise Harding and her team of 3 graduate students were studying the subglacial plumbing of the ice field, venturing into the surreal, blue-walled tunnels carved by summer meltwater. It was dangerous work, requiring climbing skills, nerve, and constant vigilance. Their only link to the outside world was a set of powerful VHF radios that allowed them to communicate between the surface camp and the survey teams inside the ice. The phenomenon began on their 3rd day of fieldwork. 2 of the students, Ben and Chloe, were deep inside a newly discovered ice tunnel, a winding cathedral-like passage that glowed with an ethereal blue light, filtered through hundreds of feet of ice. Elise was at the tunnel entrance, monitoring their progress and communicating via radio. Suddenly, Elise's radio crackled to life. It was Ben's voice, but it sounded strange, distorted, as if he were speaking through a layer of static. "Elise, are you there?" the voice said. "It's Ben. We're at a large chamber. Can you see our lights?" Elise keyed her microphone. "Negative, Ben. I don't have a visual. What's your status?" There was a pause. Then the voice came again. "We see a light ahead. We're going to check it out." Elise felt a surge of alarm. This was a violation of their strict safety protocol. They were never to deviate from the planned survey route. "Ben, do not proceed. Acknowledge," she commanded. The only response was a burst of static. She tried again and again, her calls swallowed by the hiss of the radio. A few minutes later, the radio crackled again. This time, it was Chloe's voice, equally distorted. "Chloe, what's your position?" Elise demanded. "Did you find Ben?" "My name is Chloe," the voice on the radio said, flat and effectless. It was a perfect imitation of the student's voice, but it was hollow, empty of her usual cheerful inflection. Then another voice broke in, a perfect mimic of the 3rd student, Mark, who was standing right next to Elise at the tunnel entrance. "My name is Mark," the radio voice said. Elise and Mark stared at each other, their faces pale. The voice on the radio was Mark's, but he hadn't spoken. Then her own voice came through the speaker, a tinny, distorted echo. "My name is Elise." It was a roll call of ghosts. The radio was playing back their own voices, but twisting them into a strange, empty litany. They were hearing perfect, real-time imitations of themselves, laced with a staticky distortion that made the hairs on their arms stand up. They immediately initiated an emergency recall. Mark, a skilled climber, rappelled into the tunnel to find Ben and Chloe. Elise stayed at the entrance, her hand trembling as she held the radio, listening to the bizarre, disembodied chorus of her team's names being repeated over and over. "Ben, Chloe, Mark, Elise." The voices overlapped, creating a terrifying hypnotic cacophony. Mark found the two students less than 100 yards from the entrance, huddled together, their faces etched with fear. They said they had heard Elise's voice on the radio, ordering them to explore a side passage. They had been about to obey when they heard Mark's voice calling for them from behind, sounding panicked and real, breaking the spell. They had no memory of the bizarre conversation Elise had heard. Safely back at their base camp, they tried to make sense of what had happened. They checked their recordings. The university required them to record all radio communications for their field notes. The playback was chilling. It had captured the entire event. The distorted voices, the ghostly roll call, everything. It was not a shared hallucination. It was a recorded physical event. The distorted quality of the voices was the most unnerving part. When analyzed later, the static wasn't random noise. It was a complex, layered sound, and deep within it, almost too faint to hear, were what sounded like whispers in a language no one could identify. The final, terrifying discovery was made when they were packing up their equipment at the end of the expedition. Mark couldn't find his spare radio, a handheld unit he kept clipped to his pack. They searched the entire camp. It was gone. On a hunch, Elise reviewed the footage from a time-lapse camera she had set up to monitor the ice tunnel's entrance. In the grainy, sped-up footage, they saw it. A few hours after the radio incident, a dark, indistinct shape seemed to emerge from the mouth of the tunnel. It moved with a strange, jerky motion, and in the last clear frame before it moved out of sight, they could see it was carrying something small and metallic. Mark's missing radio. He had been standing miles away at the base camp when the footage was recorded. The University Geology Field Notes from July 2012 described the incident in dry scientific terms, referring to it as an unexplained VHF propagation anomaly and attributing it to the unique acoustic properties of glacial ice. But the team knew they had encountered something more. They had stumbled into a place where the ice itself could listen and learn and speak. They had been called by name by a mimic living in the heart of the glacier, an entity that had stolen a piece of their technology, perhaps to better learn the language of the things that trespassed in its silent, blue world. The dorm check-in. The University of Alaska Fairbanks campus is a maze of buildings connected by a network of tunnels, a necessary feature for students to navigate the brutal winter months. In the fall, the dormitories come alive with the energy of new and returning students. For resident advisor Sarah Chen, the first few weeks of the semester were a whirlwind of check-ins, roommate disputes, and late-night fire drills. In September of 2006, amidst this organized chaos, a single, inexplicable event occurred that left a permanent chill on her college experience. It centered on Bartlett Hall, one of the oldest and most storied dorms on campus. The fourth floor of Bartlett had been closed for renovations for over a year. The entire wing was sealed off, with heavy, chain-locked doors at either end of the hallway. The rooms were empty, stripped of furniture, and the power to the floor had been disconnected at the breaker. It was a dead zone in the heart of a living building. One night, while on duty at the front desk, Sarah was reviewing the electronic keycard access log for the building. It was a routine security check. As she scrolled through the list of entries and exits, a line of data caught her eye. At 2:47 a.m., a keycard had been used to access room 413. Sarah frowned. That was impossible. Room 413 was on the sealed fourth floor. The keycard reader for that door shouldn't even have power. She checked the student ID number associated with the swipe. The system returned an error. No student assigned. Thinking it must be a software glitch, a ghost in the machine, she made a note to report it to the IT department in the morning and thought nothing more of it. The next night, it happened again. This time, the log showed two swipes, one at 2:47 a.m. for room 413 and another a minute later for room 415. Again, the swipes were linked to no known student ID. A cold prickle of unease started to crawl up Sarah's spine. This was more than a simple glitch. On the third night, she sat at the desk, her eyes glued to the real-time access monitor. She was determined to see the log entry appear herself. The minutes ticked by. The dorm grew quiet as students settled in for the night. Then, at exactly 2:47 a.m., the line of text appeared on her screen. Access granted, room 413, ID unknown. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She immediately called campus security. She explained the situation, her voice trembling slightly. The security dispatcher, though skeptical, agreed to send 2 officers to investigate. Sarah met them at the stairwell. The officers, both large, no-nonsense men, seemed unimpressed by her story, but followed her up to the 4th floor. They arrived at the heavy door that blocked access to the wing. It was secured with a thick chain and a heavy-duty padlock, just as it should be. A thick layer of dust covered the floor in front of the door, undisturbed. There was no way anyone could have passed through. One of the officers shone his powerful flashlight through the small wire glass window in the door. The hallway beyond was pitch black and silent. "Probably a wiring issue, miss," one of them said, his tone dismissive. "Something's causing the card readers to short and send a false signal." But Sarah pointed to the chain. "Then how do you explain this?" She pointed to the door of room 413, barely visible at the far end of the dark hall. It was chained from the inside. A heavy, industrial chain was looped through the door handle and secured to a metal plate on the door frame. The officers exchanged a look. Chaining a door from the inside was a serious fire code violation, and more to the point, how had someone gotten in there to do it? They made the decision to breach the wing. After getting approval, they used a pair of massive bolt cutters to snap the lock on the hallway door. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent building. They swung the heavy door open, revealing the dark, cold hallway. The air was stale and smelled of old plaster and dust. They moved down the hall, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, their boots crunching on debris. They reached room 413. The chain was thick and rusted, clearly having been in place for a very long time. It was impossible for it to have been placed there recently. With great effort, they cut the chain and pushed open the door to the room. The sight that greeted them was one of profound stillness and decay. The room was empty of furniture, but it was coated in a thick, uniform layer of dust that seemed to have been undisturbed for years. The windows were boarded up from the inside. There was no sign of recent occupation. No footprints in the dust, no graffiti on the walls, nothing. It was a tomb. A room that had been checked into for 3 consecutive nights by a phantom, and then chained shut from the inside by a ghost. The officers were visibly shaken. They could find no explanation. There was no other way in or out of the room. The access logs remained a mystery. The university's official security report from that night is a document of pure contradiction. It details the keycard swipes, the breach of the sealed wing, and the discovery of the chained room. It concludes with the recommendation that the entire electronic access system for Bartlett Hall be replaced due to unresolvable data anomalies. But Sarah knew it wasn't a problem with the data. She had seen the evidence with her own eyes. Someone, or something, had checked into a room that was no longer part of the world of the living. She transferred to another dorm the following semester, unable to shake the image of that dusty, silent room. She would forever be haunted by the thought of the unknown guest of room 413, a resident who needed no key to enter and no door to leave.